A millionaire saw a girl playing in the park. The necklace she wore belonged to his missing daughter. And before we continue, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories like this one. Enjoy the journey. It was a tranquil spring afternoon in Central Park, the kind of day that seemed to make the entire city breathe a little easier. Families dotted the lawns, children squealed as they chased kites and bubbles, and the air hummed with life. For most, it was a perfect day to relax and forget the troubles of the world. But for Alexander Whitman, a man whose name was synonymous with power and wealth, peace was an elusive concept. Alexander sat on a weathered wooden bench near the playground, his sharp gray eyes scanning the scene with a mix of longing and detachment. His tailored suit and polished shoes stood in stark contrast to the casual joggers and tourists around him, but he paid no attention to the curious glances. He wasn't here to be noticed. He was here because he needed an escape from his sterile mansion, from his silent phone, and most of all, from the gnawing ache in his heart. 5 years. That's how long it had been since Lily, his daughter, had vanished without a trace. 5 years since her laughter had filled his home, since her tiny hands had reached for his every evening when he returned from work. 5 years of endless searches, fruitless leads, and sleepless nights. The world had moved on, but Alexander couldn't. Not a single day passed without him wondering where she was, if she was safe, or if she was even alive. He tightened his grip on the disposable coffee cup in his hands, the warmth doing little to soothe the cold emptiness inside him. He had come to Central Park hoping for a moment of clarity, or perhaps a sign that life still held some semblance of meaning. Instead, what he got was something entirely unexpected. A child's laughter rang out, light and carefree, pulling his attention toward the playground. His gaze settled on a little girl darting across the grass, her dark curls bouncing as she ran. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, around the same age Lily had been when she disappeared. His chest tightened, a pang of longing piercing through him like an old wound reopening. But then, something caught his eye, a glint of gold in the sunlight. The girl turned, and Alexander's breath hitched. Around her neck hung a delicate necklace, one he would recognize anywhere. It was Lily's. The locket was unmistakable, with its intricate carvings of a rose entwined with vines, a design he had commissioned himself when Lily was born. He had given it to her on her 7th birthday, just months before she vanished. The world seemed to blur around him. Alexander rose to his feet, his coffee cup forgotten on the bench. His heart pounded as he took a step forward, then another, his eyes fixed on the locket, swaying gently as the girl moved. Questions flooded his mind. How did she have it? Was it possible? Could this girl be Lily? Before he could call out, a woman approached the girl. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with auburn hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Her clothes were plain but clean, and she carried herself with an air of quiet determination. "Mia," the woman called, her voice warm but firm. "It's time to go." The girl, Mia, ran to her and took her hand. Alexander's stomach churned. He quickened his pace, closing the distance between them. "Excuse me," he called, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "May I ask you something?" The woman turned, her expression cautious as her eyes met his. She pulled Mia closer, her grip on the child's hand tightening. "Yes," she said, her tone guarded. "That necklace," Alexander said, nodding toward a locket. "Where did you get it?" The woman's eyes flickered with something. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. "It was a gift," she said curtly. "Why do you ask?" Alexander took a breath, trying to steady himself. "Because it belonged to my daughter," he said. "She's been missing for 5 years." The woman's face paled, and she took a step back. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "But I don't know anything about that." Before Alexander could respond, she turned and began walking away, pulling Mia along with her. "Wait," he called, desperation creeping into his voice. "Please, I just need to know." "I don't have time for this," the woman snapped, her pace quickening. Within seconds, she and Mia had disappeared into the crowd, leaving Alexander standing frozen in place. His heart pounded as he stared after them, his mind racing. He had spent years chasing false leads, but this was different. The necklace wasn't just a coincidence. It was a connection, a thread tying him to his daughter. And whoever that woman was, she knew more than she was letting on. Alexander's hands clenched into fists. He wasn't going to let this lead slip away. Not this time. Alexander stared out the large window of his study, watching the city lights twinkle against the dark canvas of the night. His thoughts were consumed by the little girl he had seen in the park. Her laughter, her curls bouncing as she ran, and, most of all, that locket. Lily's locket. The image haunted him, pulling at every thread of his grief and hope. He paced the room, unable to sit still. 5 years of emptiness, of dead ends, and now this, a glimpse of something that could lead him back to his daughter. But the woman's reaction in the park had unsettled him. She wasn't just dismissive. She was afraid. She knew something, and Alexander was determined to find out what. "Greg," Alexander called out, his voice firm but edged with urgency. His driver and longtime confidant entered the room, his expression calm but alert. "Yes, Mr. Whitman?" "I need your help," Alexander said, turning to face him. "There's a woman and a little girl I saw in the park today. The girl was wearing Lily's necklace. I need to know who they are." Greg didn't flinch. Over the years, he had seen Alexander at his lowest, chasing every lead, clinging to any hope. He nodded without hesitation. "Do you have any details?" "She called the girl Mia," Alexander said, his voice tight. The woman was in her early 30s, auburn hair, modestly dressed. The girl had dark curls, about 8 years old. "That's all I know." Greg pulled out a small notebook and jotted down the details. "I'll start looking into it right away. If they're locals, I should be able to find something." Alexander nodded, his jaw clenched. "Thank you." The hours dragged on as Alexander waited for Greg's report. He sat at his desk, sifting through the file he had kept on Lily's disappearance. It was a painful ritual he had repeated countless times, but tonight felt different. Tonight, there was a glimmer of hope, a thread that, if pulled, might finally lead to answers. His fingers traced the edges of a photograph of Lily, taken on her 7th birthday. Her bright eyes and wide smile stared back at him, her small hand clutching the very necklace he had seen that little girl wearing. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. If Mia wasn't Lily, how had she come to possess the locket? And if she was Lily, why had she been taken? His mind spiraled with questions. The phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. Alexander snatched it up. "Greg." "Yes, sir," Greg replied, his voice steady. "I found something. The woman's name is Claire Bennett. She lives in Brooklyn with her daughter, Mia. From what I've gathered, she moved there about 4 years ago." Alexander's heart pounded. "Wells." "Claire works nights at a small diner," Greg continued. "Her neighbors describe her as quiet, keeps to herself. But there's something unusual. She left her previous town abruptly. No forwarding address, no explanation." Alexander's brow furrowed. "Why?" "There was a custody dispute," Greg explained. "The details are sealed, but local whispers suggest it was messy. She was granted custody of a child, then vanished shortly after." Alexander's mind raced. The timeline didn't match perfectly with Lily's disappearance, but it was close enough to raise suspicion. Could Mia be the child from the custody battle? And if so, what connection did she have to Lily? "Keep digging," Alexander said. "I need everything there is to know about Claire Bennett." "Understood," Greg replied before the line went dead. The next evening, Alexander decided to take matters into his own hands. He drove to the diner where Claire worked his heart hammering with a mix of determination and trepidation. The neon sign flickered above the entrance, casting a faint glow on the wet pavement. Through the window, he spotted Claire weaving between tables, her movements brisk but practiced. He entered, the scent of fried food and coffee filling the air. He took a seat at a corner booth, his eyes never leaving Claire as she worked. She moved with a quiet grace, her face a mask of calm. But Alexander could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her gaze flicked nervously toward the door every few minutes. When the dinner rush subsided, he stood and approached the counter. Claire looked up, her expression instantly guarded. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but cool. "Claire Bennett," Alexander said softly. Her eyes narrowed. "Do I know you?" "My name is Alexander Whitman," he said. "We spoke yesterday in the park." Her posture stiffened, and she glanced around, ensuring no one was listening. "I already told you. I don't know anything about your daughter." "I'm not here to accuse you," Alexander said, keeping his tone calm. "I just want to understand. That necklace, where did Mia get it?" Claire's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's none of your business," she said, her voice edged with defiance. "Now, if you'll excuse me." "Please," Alexander interrupted, his voice softening. "I've been searching for my daughter for 5 years. If you know anything, I'm begging you to tell me." For a moment, Claire's mask cracked. Her eyes flickered with something. Fear, guilt, or perhaps pity. But just as quickly, she composed herself. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, turning away. "Leave me alone." Before Alexander could respond, she disappeared into the kitchen. He stood there, frustration and desperation swirling inside him. He had hoped for answers, but instead, he was left with more questions. As he stepped out into the crisp night air, Alexander made a silent vow. Claire Bennett might not have given him the truth tonight, but he wasn't going to stop. Whoever she was, whatever she knew, he would uncover it. For Lily, Alexander couldn't let go of the unease Claire's reaction had stirred in him. Her sharp dismissal, the fear that flickered across her face when he mentioned Lily. It wasn't the behavior of someone who was uninvolved. It was the behavior of someone hiding something. As he sat in his dimly lit study that night, surrounded by the remnants of years of searching, he felt the weight of every unanswered question pressing down on him. Greg entered the room quietly, carrying a folder. "Sir, I found more about Claire Bennett," he said, setting it on the desk. Alexander's sharp eyes immediately locked onto the folder, his fingers reaching for it before Greg could even sit down. "Tell me," Alexander said, flipping it open. Greg cleared his throat. "Claire moved to Brooklyn about 4 years ago. Before that, she lived in a small town upstate. There's not much on record about her time there, but I found court documents indicating she was involved in a custody dispute around the time she left." Alexander's head snapped up. "Custody dispute?" "Yes," Greg continued. "The records are sealed, so I don't have the specifics. But from what I gathered in local news clippings, Claire was granted custody of a young child after what appears to have been a contentious case. Not long after, she vanished from the town without leaving any trace." Alexander's mind raced. A custody battle. A child. It couldn't be a coincidence. Mia? Was she the child involved? "It's possible," Greg said carefully. "The timeline fits, but without access to the sealed records, I can't confirm it." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his thoughts a whirlwind. If Claire had taken custody of Mia, why had she fled? And how did Lily's necklace end up with the girl? The questions piled up, and each one seemed more urgent than the last. "Keep looking," Alexander said firmly. "I need to know everything. Who was involved in that custody dispute, why Claire left, and most importantly, how Mia ties into this." Greg nodded. "Understood." The next morning, Alexander decided he couldn't wait for more answers to fall into his lap. He drove to Claire's neighborhood, a quiet block in Brooklyn lined with modest apartment buildings. Parking a short distance away, he watched from his car, his eyes fixed on the entrance to her building. Hours passed, but Alexander's patience didn't waver. Finally, he saw her. Claire stepped out, dressed in a simple coat, her auburn hair tied back. She looked around cautiously before walking down the street, holding Mia's hand. The little girl's curls bounced as she skipped beside her, completely unaware of the storm brewing around her. Alexander's heart clenched as he watched them. Every instinct screamed at him to confront Claire again, but he knew better than to make another impulsive move. Instead, he followed them at a safe distance, weaving through the crowded streets as they made their way to a nearby park. From a bench, Alexander observed as Mia ran to the swings, her laughter ringing out like a melody he hadn't heard in years. Claire sat nearby, her posture tense as she kept a watchful eye on the girl. She seemed protective, even anxious, as if constantly looking over her shoulder. It wasn't the demeanor of someone who felt safe. Greg's earlier words echoed in Alexander's mind. She vanished without a trace after the custody case. The pieces were beginning to align, but the picture they painted was still incomplete. As Mia played, Claire reached into her bag and pulled out a book, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped through the pages. Alexander took a deep breath, steeling himself. This time, he would approach differently. No accusations, no pressure. He needed Claire to trust him, to see that he wasn't her enemy. When the moment felt right, Alexander stood and walked toward her. Claire noticed him immediately, her body tensing as her eyes darted toward Mia. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Alexander said quickly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I just want to talk." Claire's jaw tightened. "You don't seem to understand a word, no, Mr. Whitman." "I understand," Alexander said gently, sitting on the edge of the bench, a respectful distance away. "But I also understand that you're scared, and that tells me you know something." "Please, Claire, I'm not your enemy." For a moment, she said nothing, her gaze fixed on Mia. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "You're right," she said softly. "I am scared, but not for the reasons you think." "Then help me understand," Alexander pressed. "Tell me the truth. Where did Mia get that necklace?" Claire hesitated, her hands clutching the book in her lap. "It's not that simple," she murmured. "I don't know everything, but what I do know, it's dangerous." "Dangerous for who?" Alexander asked. "For you. For Mia. Or for the people who took my daughter." Claire's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide with shock. "You think Mia has something to do with your daughter?" Alexander leaned closer, his voice steady but urgent. "That necklace belonged to Lily. It was custom-made. There's no way it's a coincidence. Please, Claire, if you know anything, I need to hear it." She looked down, her fingers tracing the edges of the book. "Mia came to me 4 years ago," she said quietly. "It was a stormy night. I heard a knock at my door, and when I opened it, there she was, soaking wet, clutching that necklace like her life depended on it. She wouldn't tell me much, just that she was scared and couldn't go back to where she came from." Alexander's chest tightened. "Did you call the police?" "I tried," Claire admitted. "But the moment I did, strange things started happening. Men in suits showed up near my house. I got anonymous calls telling me to keep quiet. It was clear someone didn't want her found." "Did she ever mention a name?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone she was running from." Claire hesitated, then nodded. "She mentioned a man. She called him Mr. Black. That's all I know." Alexander's mind raced. Mr. Black. The name felt like a key to the door he had been trying to unlock for years. "Claire," he said, his voice firm, "I don't know who this Mr. Black is, but I'm going to find out. And if he's connected to Lily's disappearance, I'll make him talk." Claire looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "If you're serious about this, I'll help you." But you have to promise me one thing. Keep me safe. Alexander met her gaze, his resolve unshakable. I promise. Alexander had never felt so determined. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but each new revelation brought with it a storm of questions. He sat in his study, the name Mr. Black etched into his mind like a warning. If this shadowy figure was involved in Lily's disappearance, Alexander knew he would stop at nothing to uncover the truth. Greg entered the room, his expression grave as he handed Alexander a fresh folder. "Sir, I dug deeper into Mr. Black," he said, his voice low. "It's not a name, it's an alias. The man is tied to a private security firm called Blackwell Security." Alexander's sharp eyes narrowed. "And what does this firm specialize in?" Greg hesitated. "They don't advertise their services openly, but their reputation speaks volumes. They're known for handling sensitive matters, covering up scandals, making problems disappear. If they're involved in Lily's case, it means whoever took her had both money and influence." Alexander leaned back in his chair, the weight of the revelation sinking in. "Where are they based?" "They operate out of a nondescript office building in Midtown," Greg replied. "But sir, I need to warn you, if you confront them directly, it could get dangerous. These aren't people who play by the rules." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Danger doesn't concern me, Greg. Finding Lily does." The next morning, Alexander prepared for what he knew would be one of the most challenging confrontations of his life. He dressed in a sharp black suit, his demeanor calm but resolute. As he approached the Blackwell Security building, his heart pounded in his chest. The sleek glass facade reflected the bustling city around it, but to Alexander, it felt like a fortress guarding secrets. He stepped through the revolving doors, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. The receptionist, a young woman with a professional smile, looked up as he approached. "Good morning, sir," she greeted. "How can I assist you?" "I'm here to see Mr. Black," Alexander said, his voice firm and unwavering. Her smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Alexander replied. "But tell him Alexander Whitman is here. He'll want to see me." The receptionist hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. After a moment, she picked up the phone, murmuring something quietly. When she hung up, her expression was carefully neutral. "Please have a seat. Someone will be with you shortly." Minutes later, two men in dark suits appeared, their expressions unreadable. "Mr. Whitman," one of them said, his voice low. "Follow us." Alexander complied, walking between them as they led him to an elevator. The ride to the top floor was silent, the tension in the small space almost suffocating. When the doors opened, Alexander stepped into a dimly lit office, the air thick with authority and secrecy. Behind a large mahogany desk sat a man who could only be Mr. Black. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his sharp suit exuded power. But it was his eyes, cold, calculating, that sent a chill down Alexander's spine. "Mr. Whitman," Mr. Black greeted, his tone calm but edged with menace. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Alexander didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You know why I'm here," he said, his voice steady. "My daughter, Lily, disappeared 5 years ago. Your name came up, and your firm is known for making people disappear. I want answers." Mr. Black leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You don't mince words, do you?" he said. "But I think you're mistaken. Blackwell Security is a legitimate business. We don't deal in disappearances." "Don't insult my intelligence," Alexander snapped, his tone sharp. "I've spent years chasing dead ends, but now I'm here. Tell me where my daughter is, or I'll tear this place apart." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Mr. Black sighed, leaning forward. "You're persistent, I'll give you that," he said. but you're asking questions that could get you hurt. I'm not afraid of you, Alexander retorted. The only thing I fear is not finding my daughter. So, tell me, where is she? Mr. Black studied him, his expression unreadable. Finally, he opened a drawer and pulled out a thin folder, sliding it across the desk. This is all I have, he said. Take it and leave. Alexander snatched the folder, his hands trembling as he opened it. Inside were photographs, documents, and a single name. His breath caught as he read it, disbelief and anger washing over him in waves. Robert Whitman, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Alexander's mind reeled as he left the building, clutching the folder tightly. His brother, his own flesh and blood, had orchestrated Lily's disappearance. The betrayal cut deeper than anything he had ever experienced. How could Robert do this? And why? Greg was waiting for him by the car, his face etched with concern. What did you find out? He asked. Alexander handed him the folder, his voice cold. My brother. He's behind it all. Greg's eyes widened as he flipped through the documents. Robert, are you sure? Positive, Alexander said, his jaw clenched. He used Blackwell's security to cover his tracks. I don't know why yet, but I intend to find out. That night, Alexander sat in his study, the folder spread out before him. The evidence was damning. Bank transfers, emails, and records linking Robert to Blackwell's security. But the question that haunted Alexander was why. What could Robert possibly gain by taking Lily away? As he stared at the documents, a fiery resolve burned within him. Robert had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and Alexander would make him pay. For Lily, for himself, for the years they had lost. The path ahead was clear, and Alexander knew it wouldn't be easy. But he was ready. The truth was within his grasp, and he wouldn't stop until he uncovered it all. Alexander sat in the dim glow of his study, the folder from Mr. Black spread across his desk. The name inside echoed in his mind like a cruel joke. Robert Whitman, his brother, his confidant, the man he had trusted most in the world. The betrayal cut deeper than he thought possible, sharper than any of the losses he had endured over the past 5 years. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showing large transfers from their shared company account to shell corporations tied to Blackwell security. Emails sent under aliases, coordinating efforts to handle a situation. And finally, a timeline of events that aligned perfectly with Lily's disappearance. There was no denying it. Robert had orchestrated everything. But why? Alexander couldn't fathom a motive that would justify such a heinous act. They had built their empire together, side by side. They had shared the triumphs and weathered storms. And yet, Robert had stolen his daughter, his reason for living, and shattered his world. Greg entered the room quietly, his expression solemn. Sir, I've gone through the documents, he said. It's damning. There's no doubt Robert was involved. Alexander nodded, his gaze fixed on the papers before him. The question is why, he said, his voice low. What could he possibly gain from taking Lily away? Greg hesitated, then cleared his throat. I looked into Robert's financials. Around the time of Lily's disappearance, there were significant discrepancies in the company accounts. It looks like he was embezzling funds, millions of dollars. My guess is he needed a distraction to keep you from noticing. A distraction, Alexander repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. He tore my family apart for money. It seems that way, Greg said. But there's more. One of the emails suggests that Robert didn't intend for Lily to vanish permanently. The plan was to hide her temporarily. But something went wrong. Alexander's chest tightened. What went wrong? I don't know yet, Greg admitted. But it's clear he lost control of the situation. That's likely why he turned to Blackwell Security, to clean up the mess. Alexander's thoughts churned as he processed Greg's words. If Robert's actions had spiraled out of control, it meant there was still a chance to uncover the full truth and bring Lily home. But confronting his brother wouldn't be easy. Robert was cunning, manipulative, and well-connected. Alexander would need to tread carefully. The following morning, Alexander arrived at the corporate headquarters he and Robert had built together. The towering glass building felt cold and hollow, a stark contrast to the pride it had once inspired. Alexander marched through the lobby, his presence commanding, as employees turned to watch him pass. He didn't stop until he reached Robert's office on the top floor. Without knocking, Alexander pushed open the door. Robert looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from surprise to unease. "Alex," he said, forcing a smile. "What brings you here so early?" Alexander didn't respond immediately. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "We need to talk," he said, his tone icy. Robert leaned back in his chair, feigning nonchalance. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Alexander placed the folder on the desk, sliding it toward Robert. "This." Robert's eyes flickered with recognition as he opened the folder. His confident facade cracked as he scanned the documents, his face paling. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice trembling. "It doesn't matter where I got it," Alexander said. "What matters is that I know the truth. You took Lily. You used Blackwell's security to cover your tracks. And for what? Money." Robert's jaw tightened. "You don't understand," he said defensively. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "Then explain it to me," Alexander demanded, his voice rising. "Because all I see is a brother who betrayed me, who tore my family apart for his own gain." Robert stood, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "I didn't have a choice," he snapped. "The company was on the brink of collapse. I had to move money around to keep us afloat. And Lily." Alexander shot back. "How does she fit into this?" Robert's gaze faltered. "I needed a distraction," he admitted. "Something to buy me time while I fixed the books. Taking Lily was supposed to be temporary, just enough to keep you focused on something else." Alexander's fists clenched. "Temporary? Do you hear yourself? You kidnapped my daughter." "I didn't kidnap her," Robert said quickly. "I arranged for her to be hidden, to be safe. But something went wrong. The people I hired, they took her somewhere I couldn't track. That's when I turned to Blackwell Security." Alexander's heart pounded. "And you didn't think to tell me? To ask for my help?" "I couldn't," Robert said, his voice breaking. "You would have ruined everything. The company, our reputation, everything we built." Alexander stared at his brother, his anger giving way to disgust. "You destroyed everything anyway," he said coldly. "You destroyed me." The confrontation left Alexander reeling. He left the office without another word, his mind racing with the implications of Robert's confession. If Robert had lost control of the situation, it meant Lily could still be out there, hidden by the very people Robert had hired. Back in his study, Alexander turned to Greg. "We need to find these people," he said. "Whoever Robert hired to take Lily, they're the key to bringing her home." Greg nodded. "I've already started looking into it. Based on the documents, the group Robert worked with operated through a series of intermediaries. It'll take time to untangle." "We don't have time," Alexander said firmly. "Lily has been missing for 5 years. Every second counts." Greg's expression softened. "We'll find her, sir. I promise." As the hours stretched into the night, Alexander couldn't shake the image of Lily's locket. It had led him this far, and he wasn't about to stop now. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but he was ready to face it. The morning after his confrontation with Robert, Alexander sat in his study, staring at the growing pile of evidence that had consumed his life. Robert's confession had left him shaken, but it also reignited a fire within him. The people who had taken Lily were still out there, operating in the shadows, and Alexander was more determined than ever to uncover their identities and bring his daughter home. Greg entered the room, a laptop tucked under his arm. "Sir, I've been digging into the intermediaries Robert mentioned," he said. "It's a tangled web, but I've managed to trace some of the transactions to a group operating out of an abandoned industrial area in Queens. They're known for facilitating discreet operations. Alexander looked up sharply. Discreet operations? That's a polite way of saying they specialize in human trafficking and kidnappings. Greg nodded grimly. That's exactly what they do. If Lily was handed over to them, they might still have records or leads on where she could be. Then we're going, Alexander said, rising from his chair. Greg hesitated. Sir, these people aren't like the ones you've dealt with before. They're dangerous. If we walk in unprepared, we might not walk out. Alexander's jaw tightened. I don't care about the risks, Greg. This is my daughter we're talking about. Greg sighed, knowing there was no arguing with him. All right, but we do this carefully. That evening, Alexander and Greg arrived at the industrial area in Queens. The place was eerily quiet, the air thick with the scent of oil and rust. Shadows loomed large under the dim glow of flickering streetlights, giving the area an ominous feel. Greg parked the car a block away, and they approached on foot, their movements cautious and deliberate. The building in question was a decrepit warehouse, its windows boarded up and its entrance guarded by two burly men in dark clothing. Alexander's heart pounded as he sized up the situation. This wasn't going to be easy. Greg leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. We need a way in without alerting them. Let me create a diversion. Alexander nodded reluctantly. Be careful. Greg walked toward the guards, feigning drunkenness. Hey, fellas, he slurred, stumbling as he approached. Got any spare change? The guards exchanged annoyed glances. Get out of here, old man, one of them barked. Greg staggered closer, muttering incoherently. As the guards moved to push him away, Alexander slipped around the side of the building, finding an unlocked side door. His heart raced as he stepped inside, the dim interior lit only by the faint glow of overhead lights. The warehouse was a maze of crates and equipment, the air filled with the faint hum of machinery. Alexander moved silently, his senses heightened. He could hear voices in the distance, low and urgent. Following the sound, he came upon a small office tucked in the corner of the warehouse. Peeking through the cracked door, he saw two men hunched over a desk, sifting through papers. Alexander's gaze locked onto the stack of files on the desk. He couldn't be sure, but he had a gut feeling that those files contained the answers he needed. Taking a deep breath, Alexander pushed the door open, stepping inside. The men looked up in surprise, their hands instinctively reaching for weapons. But Alexander raised his hands, his voice steady. I'm not here to cause trouble, he said. I just want information. One of the men sneered. You've got the wrong place, buddy. Do I? Alexander said, his gaze unwavering. I know this operation specializes in taking people off the grid. 5 years ago, my daughter was taken. Her name is Lily Whitman. I want to know where she is. The men exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. Finally, one of them spoke. We don't deal in names. We deal in transactions. Unless you've got proof, we can't help you. Alexander reached into his pocket, pulling out a photo of Lily and the locket she wore. This locket was hers, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It's been traced back to this operation. If you know anything, tell me. The men stared at the photo for a long moment. Then one of them nodded toward the stack of files. Search through those. If her name's in there, you'll find it. Alexander's hands shook as he sifted through the files, each page a snapshot of someone else's nightmare. Names, dates, transaction details. It was a grim ledger of human lives reduced to commodities. Finally, he found it, a file labeled with a code that matched Lily's case. His breath caught as he read the details. Lily had been handed off to a third party shortly after her abduction. The file didn't specify names, but it provided a location: a private estate upstate, owned by someone with deep pockets and a penchant for secrecy. Who owns this estate? Alexander demanded, his eyes burning with intensity. The man shrugged. We don't ask questions about our clients. All we know is that whoever owns it doesn't like visitors. That's all I needed to know, Alexander said, tucking the file into his coat. Before he could leave, the second man stepped forward. You shouldn't go there, he warned. People who dig too deep into this disappear. You're better off forgetting about it. Alexander turned to face him, his voice cold and unyielding. I've already lost everything that matters. There's nothing left to take. With that, he left the warehouse, his resolve stronger than ever. Greg was waiting for him by the car, his face etched with worry. Did you find anything? Yes, Alexander said, holding up the file. We're going upstate. Tonight. Greg hesitated, then nodded. Let's go. As they drove through the darkened streets, Alexander's mind raced. The pieces were finally coming together, but the picture they formed was more sinister than he had imagined. Whoever had taken Lily wasn't just hiding her. They were protecting a secret worth killing for. But Alexander wasn't afraid. For the first time in 5 years, he felt like he was closing in on the truth. And no matter what lay ahead, he was ready to face it. The narrow, winding road leading to the estate felt like a passage into another world. Dense trees flanked the path, their branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. Alexander sat in the passenger seat, the file from the warehouse clenched in his hands. His jaw was set, his mind racing with possibilities. Each turn of the road brought him closer to a truth he had waited 5 long years to uncover. Greg, his ever-reliable companion, gripped the steering wheel tightly. Sir, are you sure about this? He asked, his voice tense. This place doesn't look like somewhere people leave alive. I've come too far to turn back now, Alexander replied. Whatever's waiting for us up there, I need to face it. The car rounded a final bend, and the estate came into view. It was a sprawling mansion, its stone walls dark and foreboding against the night sky. A wrought iron gate stood at the entrance, flanked by surveillance cameras that swiveled to follow their movements. Greg parked a safe distance away, and the 2 men stepped out, their breath visible in the chilly air. Let's do this, Alexander said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside him. The gate was locked, but Greg, ever resourceful, produced a set of tools and began working on the mechanism. Within minutes, the gate clicked open with a soft groan. They slipped inside, moving silently along the gravel driveway that led to the mansion's entrance. The grand structure loomed above them, its windows dark and lifeless. Alexander paused, his eyes scanning the property. They'll have security, he murmured. Be ready for anything. Greg nodded, pulling a small flashlight from his pocket. If this goes sideways. It won't, Alexander interrupted. Let's move. The front door was locked as expected, but Greg quickly found another way in, a side entrance that led to a service corridor. The air inside was cool and stale, the faint scent of dust and neglect lingering in the space. They moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet underfoot. The mansion was eerily quiet, its grand halls filled with shadows that danced under the beam of Greg's flashlight. Alexander's heart pounded as they passed ornate furniture, gilded mirrors, and faded portraits. Every detail felt out of place, as though the house itself were frozen in time. As they approached the central staircase, a faint noise caught Alexander's attention, a low murmur, barely audible. He signaled for Greg to stop, straining to hear. The sound grew louder as they moved toward the back of the mansion, leading them to a door slightly ajar. Through the crack, Alexander could see a dimly lit room filled with monitors. A man sat at a desk, his back to them, watching security footage from cameras placed throughout the property. Alexander's fists clenched. This was their chance to gather intel. Greg whispered, "What's the plans?" "I'll handle him," Alexander replied, his voice low. "Stay back." He pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside with deliberate calm. The man at the desk turned, startled, but before he could react, Alexander closed the distance between them and grabbed him by the collar. "Who are you working for?" Alexander demanded, his voice a growl. The man's eyes darted around the room, panic evident on his face. "I don't know what you're talking about." Alexander slammed him against the desk. "Don't lie to me. I know what this place is, and I know who you're protecting. Where is she?" "I swear, I don't know anything," the man stammered. "I'm just here to monitor the cameras." Greg stepped into the room, his flashlight illuminating the man's terrified expression. "He's not going to talk," Greg said grimly. "But maybe these will." He gestured to the monitors, which displayed live feeds from various parts of the estate. One camera caught Alexander's attention immediately, a feed showing a locked room with a small bed and a desk. The sight made his breath catch. The room was sparse, but it was occupied. A young girl sat at the desk, her back to the camera, her dark hair falling over her shoulders. "Lily," Alexander whispered, his voice breaking. Without another word, Alexander turned and ran. He followed the path on the monitor, Greg close behind him. The mansion was a labyrinth, its endless halls and twisting corridors designed to confuse intruders. But Alexander's desperation propelled him forward, his determination cutting through the disorienting layout. Finally, they reached the lock room. The heavy steel door was reinforced, a keypad mounted beside it. Alexander pounded on the door, his voice raw with emotion. "Lily, Lily, it's me." From inside, a faint voice replied, trembling with disbelief. "Daddy." The word shattered Alexander's composure. He pressed his forehead against the door, tears streaming down his face. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here." Greg examined the keypad, muttering under his breath as he worked to bypass the security system. Seconds felt like hours as Alexander waited, his heart aching to see his daughter again. Finally, with a soft beep, the lock disengaged. The door swung open, and there she was. Lily stood in the center of the room, her eyes wide with shock and recognition. Alexander fell to his knees, his arms opening as she ran to him. "Daddy," she cried, her small frame trembling as she clung to him. Alexander held her tightly, his tears soaking into her hair. "I'm so sorry, Lily," he whispered. "I'm so sorry it took me this long." Greg stood by the door, his expression softening as he watched the reunion. "We need to move," he said gently. "This place won't stay quiet for long." Alexander nodded, pulling back to look into Lily's tear-streaked face. "We're going home," he said, his voice firm. "No one will ever take you away from me again." As they made their way out of the mansion, the tension in the air was palpable. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow seemed to threaten their escape. But Alexander's resolve never wavered. With Lily's hand tightly in his, he led her through the darkness, determined to bring her to safety. When they finally emerged into the cold night air, Alexander felt a weight lift from his chest. For the first time in 5 years, he held his daughter in his arms. And though the journey was far from over, he knew they had taken the first step toward healing the wounds of the past. The journey back to the city was silent, save for the hum of the car engine. Alexander sat in the back seat, his arms wrapped protectively around Lily. She leaned into him, her small frame trembling as the adrenaline of the night began to wear off. Greg drove with his usual precision, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds, scanning for any sign of pursuit. Alexander couldn't stop staring at Lily. 5 years of anguish melted away as he held her close, her familiar scent and warmth filling the void that had consumed him for so long. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his voice soft but steady. "You're safe now, sweetheart. No one will hurt you ever again." Lily looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with a mix of relief and confusion. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice cracking. I thought you'd forgotten me." Alexander's heart shattered. He pulled her tighter against him, his voice breaking. "I could never forget you, Lily. I search for you every day. I never gave up. I promise you, we're together now, and nothing will ever take you away from me again." By the time they reached Alexander's home, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. Greg parked the car in the driveway, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "We made it," he said quietly, turning to look at Alexander. "But this isn't over. Whoever's behind this won't let it slide." "I don't care," Alexander replied, his voice firm. "Let them come. My only priority is Lily." Greg nodded. "I'll stay close, just in case." Inside the house, Alexander carried Lily up the grand staircase to her old bedroom. The room had remained untouched since the day she disappeared. Her favorite stuffed animals sat on the bed, and the walls were still adorned with her drawings and photos. Lily's eyes widened as she looked around, her lips trembling. "You kept everything," she said softly. "Of course I did," Alexander replied, his voice thick with emotion. "This was always your room. It was waiting for you, just like I was." Lily climbed onto the bed, clutching one of her stuffed animals tightly. Alexander sat beside her, watching as she began to relax for the first time that night. He reached out to smooth her hair, his heart swelling with a mix of love and sorrow. "Do you remember anything about where they took you?" he asked gently. "Anything at all?" Lily hesitated, her brow furrowing as she tried to recall. "It was dark," she said slowly, "and cold. There were men in suits. They didn't talk to me much, but they were always watching. One of them, he had a scar on his face." Alexander nodded, committing every detail to memory. "And the house? Did you ever leave the room?" "Not much," Lily admitted. "But sometimes I heard voices. They talked about someone important, someone they were afraid of." "Mr. Black," Alexander murmured, the name sending a chill down his spine. Lily nodded. "They called him that once. But there was another name, someone they worked for, a woman. They called her Margot." Alexander's blood ran cold. The name was unfamiliar, but the revelation added another layer to the mystery. Who was Margot, and what role had she played in Lily's abduction? He knew he couldn't rest until he found out. But for now, Lily's safety came first. After tucking her into bed, Alexander returned to his study, where Greg was waiting. The older man had poured himself a cup of coffee, his eyes heavy with exhaustion but sharp with determination. "She remembered a name," Alexander said, sitting across from him. "Margot. Does that mean anything to you?" Greg frowned, setting down his cup. "Not off the top of my head, but I'll start digging. If she's connected to Mr. Black, there'll be a trail somewhere." "Good," Alexander said, "but we need to be careful. Whoever these people are, they won't take this lightly." Greg nodded. "I'll handle it. You focus on Lily." Over the next few days, Alexander devoted himself to helping Lily adjust. She was timid at first, clinging to him whenever he left the room, but gradually, she began to open up. They spent hours talking, playing games, and going through old photo albums. Each smile and laugh from Lily felt like a small victory, a step toward healing the scars of the past. But the shadow of Margot loomed large. Greg worked tirelessly to uncover her identity, piecing together fragments of information from old files and whispered rumors. What he found was chilling. Margot Fontaine, Greg said one evening, laying a folder on Alexander's desk. A name that's whispered in the circles of power and influence. She's a shadow figure, untouchable, with connections in politics, business, and law enforcement. If she's involved, she's the one pulling the strings. Alexander's jaw tightened. "And what does she want with Lily?" Greg sighed. That's the part one can't figure out. But it's clear she's dangerous. If you go after her, it could put both you and Lily at risk. I'm not afraid of her, Alexander said firmly. She took my daughter. She tore my life apart. She'll answer for it. That night, as Alexander sat by Lily's bedside, watching her sleep, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. But beneath that peace was a simmering resolve. He had brought Lily home, but the fight was far from over. Margot Fontaine and her shadowy network were still out there, and Alexander knew he couldn't truly rest until they were brought to justice. He leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to Lily's forehead. "I'll protect you," he whispered, "no matter what it takes." As he left the room, his mind churned with plans and strategies. The road ahead would be long and perilous, but Alexander was ready. For Lily, he would face any danger, confront any enemy, and dismantle any empire that dared stand in his way. The battle wasn't over, but the first victory was his. Lily was home, and that was all that mattered, for now. And now, I want to hear from you. Which part of this story touched your heart the most? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. And of course, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more narratives like this. Each subscription helps us continue bringing exciting stories to you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.